All right, good morning, everybody. How are you? This is kind of odd for somebody who doesn't do demos to be up behind this big table here, but welcome. They gave me kind of a silly announcement to start off with this morning. They want me to make sure that you know that this is the reef room. This is not the reef exhibit, so no sharks will be used in this presentation. So if you're here to see sharks, you might be disappointed. How many people are just up from last night? I just want to make sure we put the house lights up so you'd stay awake. We got a couple here, so yeah, I thought it was pretty fascinating last night. You know, Las Vegas is a city of magic, and I was sharing with some friends that I was able to turn $80 into $5.25, which I thought that was pretty fun. So let's start talking a little bit about social computing. I'll actually start with a little background because we don't have the voice of God in these sessions introducing people, and so I thought I'd do something to show you my social graph a little bit. There's my bio. I won't read it to you. Feel free, because I will be checking after this session. It is on social computing. I will be checking the Twitterverse afterwards. If instead of saying Daniel Rasmus is presenting, it's at DW Rasmus1. Feel free to tweet about anything that you like or don't like about the presentation. If you want to continue the dialogue, you can go to listeningtothefuture.com, which is the website for the book, and I'd be happy to have a conversation with you on multiple channels that are outlined there. And we'll go on to the stuff that you came to hear. So this is what we're going to be talking about. Why social computing? What do we mean when we say social computing? Because there's a lot of discussion about that. Why ROI is so elusive. Using social computing at work, why that's different. Because the world is not the same in the workplace. I don't know about you, but I have a little bit different requirements when I'm working on projects at work than when I'm talking with my friends on Facebook. So we have to realize that that reality exists. And then we have some huge issues around economics. One of the biggest issues that we have with social computing is we do not have an economic language to understand non-linear work. We still live in an industrial age. Well, we actually don't live in the industrial age, but we haven't figured out yet that we don't live there yet. And so we haven't created an economic language to describe the world that we live in. I just wrote a paper recently that started off that if all the economics you have were invented during the industrial age, everything looks like a factory. And so we talk a lot about productivity, we talk a lot about efficiency, and we talk about how can we get more patients through a hospital. I had that conversation recently with some hospital administrators. Well, doctors were looking on going, oh my God. And they were, and I said, well, what do you guys want to work on? They said, healthy patients. It's not a linear problem. It's a social problem. And so I thought that was quite an interesting perspective from people who work in the same company, right? And then there was a study done in Framingham, Massachusetts that I think gives us some insights around social computing as well. The contextual value. Some of you may know that my role at Microsoft is to think about the world 10 years from now, which means that I don't have any idea what's going to happen. But I have a robust process for dealing with that, right? Now, the whole book, Listening to the Future, is about that process. How do we take uncertainty and robustly reason through it? How do we actually put a name on things that we have no idea how they're going to turn out and look at the possibilities? And I'll share a little bit of that with you because it's absolutely critical to social computing because all the justifications that you'll see that we've discovered so far are about today. They're about what is the value of social computing in my world today. If I start looking out and doing plans, and I know some of you from the IT perspective are doing 3-year plans, 5-year plans. Well, 5 years from now, the social computing world is going to be very different than it is today, but we don't know exactly how it's going to be different. So we have to think about that in a robust way, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then what should you be doing? A little bit of recommendation guidance. We'll open it up to some questions. So, let's start off with just the idea of social computing. It comes from the consumer world. Now, we keep coming up against these consumer events that impinge on IT, right? Think about in the early 1980s, I remember, because I'm old, I remember that I had a mini computer, and people started bringing in personal computers. And we all complained about this phenomenon. And at the time, people were making kits, right? They were Heath kits and Altairs and other things. They were kits. They were hobby things, right? And now they've become standard. And this is not new either because, Socrates years ago said, this whole invention of the writing thing is going to ruin people's memories. And the New York Times did an article on the typewriter and said the typewriter is going to do two things. It was going to completely ruin people's writing abilities, and I thought this was quite fascinating, and it is going to make people who don't deserve to be published look like they were published. Now, where have I heard that before? Blogging, perhaps, right? And so technology has continuously gone in from the consumer world and changed the business world. So don't be afraid of that, right? You look at these numbers, Facebook is the, fourth largest country in the world? 300 million people, right? 2/3 of those people are not in college. This was a project, and this is another thing to remember, right? Technology does not turn out the way that its inventors intend it to. This was a way to connect college people together. 2/3 of the people on Facebook aren't in college. And who knows, some of them never were in college, right? 130 friends per user, 6 billion minutes spent, right? Hopefully you have one of those unlimited minutes plans when you're using this. And 40 million users update their statuses at least once a day, right? That's why we're talking about this. This is a huge social phenomenon, right? Facebook is growing. MySpace, people go, oh, MySpace, that's so yesterday. It's still 70 million people. It's down 3.4 million from the previous year, but that's still enormous, right? Not as big, however, as the U.S. government yet, though. So 81 million people visited U.S. government sites in July. I think they were all trying to figure out where their cash for clunkers checks were. But so why is it so popular? Why is social computing such a phenomenon in the social world, right? In the consumer world, in our personal lives, right? Email overload, that's one. The millennial generation isn't overly fond of email. It's not that they don't use it. The experience that I've had is that they prefer not to use it, right? Sometimes they get email from their parents or from their employer, but it's much more of a spontaneous, visceral environment to see the world kind of unfold before you as it does in Facebook and Twitter. And that's a very different experience, right? It's anti-work, right? It's not the way that we, as I said earlier with the industrial age stuff, it's not the way that we work. It is a very different social phenomenon. I don't have restrictions on me in terms of I have to get something done. If somebody posts something on Facebook and I ignore it, I don't feel obligated and they don't feel like I missed anything by not commenting on their status, right? Now, how many of you would feel that way if your boss put a question up on an internal social site and said, what does everybody think about this? There'd be, the phenomenon that we call at Microsoft piling on, right? We'd have a bunch of people jump in and start commenting because their manager said something that there was an expectation that you were supposed to respond, right? There's also instant gratification. I'm sure a few of you will look like this in a few minutes after the coffee kicks in. Because when you do something, if it is a big deal, it actually starts to generate some response, right? I love it when I put a blog entry up there and I get two kinds of responses. One is people comment on a blog entry out in the consumer space, or I start looking at where the search engine hits are coming from. I'm very popular at Baidu in China. I post comments on other people's blog entries and seeing the links coming in from those blog posts into mine. And that's a phenomenon of instant gratification, right? Rapid information exchange probably doesn't need a whole lot of explanation. It is a way of communicating things very quickly. We don't have to wait. It's kind of open in a social context, and we don't have to wait to see if somebody has picked up the information. The sense of being connected. There are people who look at their, I think LinkedIn probably has the best one. You are connected to 4 billion people through your network, right? Or how many ever millions of people that each one of us have. And so you have that sense of, my people know other people, and I'm part of this big social phenomenon, and so I feel connected. And the millennial generation is very interested in that connection because they are tending now to ask advice, business advice, from their social network more than they ask advice from people in the cubicle farm that they live in, all right? Because they have a trusted relationship with their social network that they do not necessarily have at work as they're joining a new company. And we can talk more about that at the break if you're interested in the millennial phenomenon. And then it's also the sense of being in the know. You know, I can proudly say that I found out about Michael Jackson's death from Ryan Seacrest, right? Because I subscribed to him on Twitter, and I get this thing saying, I think Michael Jackson just died, checking my sources, right? And it's Ryan Seacrest, so of course he's got, the right sources. So I felt like I was connected, and you probably had those experiences as well. So that's that's kind of why it's popular externally. And internally, when we talk about social computing, there's some kind of common things that we've always done in IT, right? The competition's investing, so we've got to do this. Now remember, social computing has two aspects to it. There's a bunch of stuff that enterprises are doing with marketing, and we'll talk a little bit about that. There's outward bound marketing things, right? There's mining Twitter feeds and mining Facebook and creating fan pages and all that stuff. That's one side of the business value, but we're now talking about being able to bring that into the enterprise and take a social construct that we call a company and enable it with similar kinds of tools. I think they're going to be slightly different, but I think there's a similar kind of phenomenon that we're looking for inside of an enterprise. But as I said earlier, it will be a little different. There's as I said, there's clear marketing intimacy wins. There's not a whole lot of doubt that understanding what customers are telling us in the consumer space is important, right? We need to listen to our customers, right? You can look at the social phenomenon of Twitter and Facebook and other, well-named commercial sites. We have a fantastic, social community around our developer world, around our customers, in various products that are not on the platforms that are popular, but we literally have thousands and millions of people who are giving us feedback and engaging with each other in social sites that are not the brand names that you know about. And then there's this view, I think, and it's a little risky for enterprises to say social computing is the answer to some problem that I've already got. Right? We've got a knowledge management thing going on, right? We've got baby boomers who are retiring. Oh my God, in America, by 2012, 10,000 Americans are going to turn 65 every day. We've got to find out what they need, what they know, and make sure that we can retain that. Social computing is the answer to that problem. It's not. Social computing is a way of facilitating that dialogue. It's a potential way of capturing some knowledge. It is not the answer, right? But it should not be discounted just because it's not the answer. It is part of the answer, right, potentially, depending on how you implement it, right? In many, I go back, I was the VP of Knowledge Management and Collaboration at Giga and Forrester, right? There were issues with the technology of knowledge management, but most of the issues were cultural. Social computing is not going to get you over the social issues within your enterprise. If you have people who believe that knowledge is power, if you have people who believe that the only way to manage people is to see that their butts are in seats somewhere near them, then social computing is not necessarily going to solve your issues. Right? And so you have to think about management. Right? Our Dutch subsidiary has done a fantastic job. They have recently completely shifted their fundamental way that they manage. Only 37% of the people in the Netherlands could actually even go to our office. Right? We want them with customers. We want them not in traffic. It has gone from an office to a meeting place, but we had to bring consultants in to help managers get over the I have to see people to manage them. Right? We have to get to the point that we recognize that if people have a commitment and they're following through with their commitment, do I really care where and when they do that? Right? And that's a phenomenon that we have to think about. It's the way that people get things done in today's networked economy, and you can't ignore it. So that's another thing when I'm talking to customers. They go, oh, that social computing thing, I'm not going to worry about that. Not part of my business. It is. because I love banks, right? A lot of banks have turned off social computing, and I love doing this to them because they'll say, yeah, we've turned it off. Maybe the HR people can use social computing to do recruiting, and the marketing people are doing some social computing with our customers, but nobody else has access to social computing in our enterprise. And I go, really? Did you put dampening fields around your cell phones? And they said, what do you mean? I said, well, smartphones, iPhones, other things have Twitter clients, Facebook clients. Your people are doing social computing. If they're not doing it through your network, they're still doing it, right? And so you can't just ignore it. It has been an evolution, right? As one of when we first got the PC in, it was a standalone box that basically knew how to talk to a printer, and mine talked to a cassette tape drive, right? That was my original storage medium. But it was centralized, right? It was about me and perhaps a few other people talking to a central device, and then we started getting into network. And now we're having people talk to other people, and we're having computers talk to other computers, and it's a much more organic environment that we've created, right? And so the social enterprise is no longer just about talking to servers and putting documents up on servers. It's now about people talking to people. And of course, any of the social computing technology is augmented and completely complementary with the social computing technology that we've always had, right? Telephones, meetings, right? Businesses are a social construct. We do social things regardless of if we have social technology or not. Email is a social phenomenon. One of the things that we see with social computing that's very different is that email has blind CCs in it, right? Nobody's ever used a blind CC for political with political motivations. Let me just copy my boss, right? Then he'll come down on this guy for me, right? In the social computing world, much more transparent. There's no hidden pieces of the agenda. You can certainly do that in the enterprise and have private spaces, et cetera. But in the outside world, and the expectation from younger employees is that it's going to be much more transparent. We're going to see what's going on, and that's new. So if you're not measuring ROI, this is a study that was just done. If you're not measuring ROI, don't feel bad. No one else is either. So I just want to get that off. You can now take a deep breath and go, oh, it's not just me. Now, for those who are looking at value, and it's not necessarily ROI, there are a number of places that they are finding value in social computing, right? And some of that, from the licensing standpoint, may make more sense than the social shift, right? So I just talked about email and shared workspaces. If you're still using servers with folders on them, a social computing environment, as you're hearing about in SharePoint this week, and if you already own it, it may be the right time to migrate away from folders on a server to a shared workspace that has much more capabilities, right? Since you've already licensed the technology, that's one of the places that companies are finding just at the tool level, right? And they're also finding reduced storage costs. From the information side, as I mentioned earlier, communal information. So the information's much more open. The organization becomes much more transparent. Captured for compliance and auditability. That's another big thing. A lot of the regulated industries are looking at social computing as a way of capturing the dialogue that's going on that is happening in multiple channels today, and they don't really have a handle on that conversation. And again, this is not, if everything moved tomorrow into a social computing environment, you could probably achieve that. Social computing does not mean that the other channels disappear. So we're in an integration phase right now where social computing is coexisting with instant messaging, with email, with voicemail, and other things. So that is a goal, and some companies are trying to do that. And improve quality. So the quality of the dialogue. Again, with email, if I send it out to 3 or 4 people, they may read it, they may not respond. I can't even count the number of emails I have in my inbox right now that may be unread or not responded to properly. In a social computing environment, you can see, can be much more open, and you can have many more people look at the quality of the information and actually comment on it. So it is a way of thinking about the information itself. So Wikipedia being an example of a social place where it's not, again, not a guarantee. One of the things we start seeing as we move into the social phenomenon around computing is that unlike technical computing or things like Excel, if I type in 2 plus 2 into a cell in Excel, it comes up with 4. If I type into a social media or social computing environment, what should I do with this marketing plan? There's no right answer to that problem, right? It's up to the people who are involved in that to converge and negotiate toward an answer. But the computing environment is not going to give you an answer as it does with a normal kind of computing experience. From the business side, global sourcing of talent. So this is using external sites as a way, an extension of your employee base, of your human resources reach, of ways of finding the right talent, the right people to do the jobs that you are looking for. And I apologize for keep walking over here. This is an eye chart even for me. Gathering intelligence and sensory information. So there's this idea that we talk about in the book called human sensor networks. And human sensor networks complement business intelligence. So business intelligence is all about big databases, great data sets, and I'm running algorithms on them, and look, I have an aha moment. There's something that I just learned, right? I discovered a pattern in my data. Well, there's a lot of data you can't pump through a business intelligence platform, right? A lot of unstructured data, a lot of conversation, tacit knowledge and implicit knowledge that are in people's heads. That's a social network. And so being able to make sense of that information, being able to take the business intelligence information and elevate that to the point that you are having a dialogue in the business about what does this mean and what do we do about it, that is of great value. Collaborative problem solving, very similar kind of thing to what I just mentioned. Expertise location. That is, kind of the holy grail of some of this. People, we talked about that during the knowledge management area. How do we get people to expose their expertise so that we can more rapidly find them? That's one of the reasons that you will find that all of these new computing platforms are very quickly adopted by professional services firms as early adopters. Because they know that their entire business is in the heads of their people. And if they can't find the right people, they are spending time, they're spending client time reinventing things that they already know, but they don't know how to figure out who knows it. And they are also not necessarily giving the highest quality of opinion because there may be somebody who's more qualified to answer a client question than someone else. But if they can't find that person, they have to go with what they got, right? And so there's a lot of very early adoption going on in professional services. That is not unique to professional services. R&D and in various industries and other places also very applicable. Peer-to-peer communications, increased revenue from the marketing side. Again, I don't think there's a whole lot of argument around that. There's a lot of discussion about kind of how to exactly measure that, but there are examples of increased revenue. And decreased time to value, which I find interesting. So I've done some consulting work prior to joining Microsoft with retail firms. And one of their metrics was time to floor. How quickly can we get somebody trained and on a floor so that in a very high turnover industry where we've got people who are coming in and out of retail all the time, the more time I spend training them, the less time I have to gain value from them. And so if we can use social computing to actually train people more quickly, that will be of value. Now from the marketing side, these are the 4 areas, right? Identifying and influencing peripheral audiences through the social environment. So you're targeting an audience. You say, we're going to talk to technical decision makers, but technical decision makers don't just know technical decision makers. So you get kind of some peripheral overflow from that audience investment that you've made. Becoming a hit. That, you do something, a viral video. We've done one where you've probably seen, a person jumping off of a great big slide and flying through the air, and I think we just released the video on how we actually faked that. But it was, a lot of hits and a lot of conversation that came from something that was, kind of viral. And so there's great value in increasing the hit rate. And Nielsen just did a study a couple weeks ago that basically said just click-throughs are not enough in terms of advertising, that you have to actually have good content. So it's not just about engaging. Once somebody gets there, you have to actually give them value. It's not just about the eyeballs anymore. It's about actually giving them value, so that's something you have to keep in mind. Opportunity to learn from comments. Talked about that already. And then social media isn't ephemeral in that when you put an ad into a magazine, at the end of the life cycle of that magazine, it just kind of goes away. On the web, you can have things that get picked up later. You can have things that just live a lot longer. And so there's a long tail to social media. The professional use, these are the places. So, of course, there's the most known about marketing because that's where most companies are spending their time. They're looking at internal collaboration, customer support, et cetera. So these are some of the places that organizations are actually finding value today. And some of those are pretty small percentages, right? I do a lot of strategy work with organizations. Most organizations are not using it for strategy. They're not looking at their long-term view of the organization through the lens of how can our people, in a very collective way, help us both define our strategy, our differentiation in the marketplace, and how do they help us achieve that. And I think that's going to be a great breakthrough when that kind of conversation happens. So these are the characteristics of the social system. I'm not going to read through these. I'll let you look at them. But these are some of the things on the consumer side that make a social system effective, right? So it may have reputation. There's a personal work perspective to it. It's pretty ad hoc, right? There's not a whole lot of planning that goes on. So as some of you are typing and hopefully you're doing something on the social media world right now, this was unplanned. There's no structure around what you're doing. It's message-centric, pretty small atoms in terms of the content. In business, right, you don't usually have people pop up on Facebook and say, here's my strategic plan, right? And they post that up on the social site that you would go to as a consumer. Inside the business, they might. I just did a 47-page document, and I'd like to get your opinion on it. There it is, right? That's a whole different thing inside of the business, right? And so these are some of those areas where work is different, right? Getting things done. We all have to get things done. Nobody gets things done except for maybe a family reunion on a social computing site in the consumer world. There are processes. We actually have defined processes and rules about how we do things in a company. And there really aren't that many of those in the social computing world. Negotiated priorities. Right? When you decide that you're going to post that I had pancakes this morning for breakfast on Facebook, probably not a big priority for any of the people reading that. They may be interested. They may even ask you what kind of pancakes, but it's not a high priority item for them. Time constraints, right? We have to get things done within a fixed time. Let me see how I'm doing. And we have to, make sure that we meet our project objectives. We have functional silos, right? Eventually, if all of the prophecies come true, social computing will break down all the functional silos and we'll all have a great corporate kumbaya moment. But in the meantime, we have silos within our organization, which probably do not exist in our social phenomenon. Our friends are our friends, and our friends are our friends' friends, and there's really nothing to worry about there. I was interviewing people. You may have seen me with a camera crew running around. There are people who, were saying on video yesterday, Mike, we're not sure if we put in enterprise social computing, there are people who don't want to let other people see what they're doing in their department. Right? And I said, well, that's not enterprise social computing. That's, old-fashioned corporate stuff, right? And that's not where we're going with this. Physical and virtual spaces. In the consumer world, it's almost all virtual. Right? The entire experience, very rarely, and I mean, maybe you're very close friends, but a lot of the people that you know are just virtual. There's never and I've not heard this yet, I've not heard anybody say, I'm having a Facebook reunion. Maybe they have, but that all of the people on Facebook are actually invited to come to a park on a Sunday afternoon and see each other. Right? That has not happened. There have been some smart mob kind of activities, but that's not very common. But at work, we actually come to work. We have to see the people in our social network, right? It is a collective phenomenon, but it is one that is very governed by the structure of the organization and the place that we go to work. Regulatory and legal environments. There may be some things that happen in the social world that you have to worry about. We're starting to see libel and slander and certain other kinds of legal issues crop up in social computing. But you don't usually have the SEC or the Fed or some other regulatory body watching what you're doing on a social site. If you are doing enterprise computing, if you're doing enterprise social computing and it spills over into the consumer world, there's probably a regulatory body that's watching how that happens, right? There are legacy systems. The social environments in the consumer space just popped up, right? There was no, I have to migrate from MySpace to Facebook, right? Nobody really had that argument with themselves. You probably have some arguments with yourselves about migrating from different platforms over the course of time or integrating with those. And so that's something that's very different in the work environment. Legacy communications, you do have all of these other channels that are coexisting with the social environment. And we have a very document-centric world. Right? It is not about messages, it's about documents. And it's not about links. We do a lot of documents. And so from spreadsheets to PowerPoint presentations to Word documents and Visio diagrams and all kinds of other things, that's how we communicate the bulk of our value within organizations. It is not through 140 character bits of information, right? Employee reviews, so there are expectations that are set. You know, I had somebody yesterday, again, in one of the interviews say, you know, really, even if we did just enterprise social computing, if we turned off all the external stuff, my boss would still think I was wasting my time writing things down because I had things to do, and me telling people what I knew is really not my job. Now, when we think about the cultural shifts that need to take place in terms of the retiring baby boomers, that's a big deal. Right? If the baby boomers are not only holding on to the knowledge because they say, you know, I can stick around longer, I just looked at my 401k and I really need this job for a long time, versus let's open this up and actually pass the knowledge on to the millennials. But if the management philosophy is get the stuff done before you tell people what you know, we're back to the issue that we had with knowledge management, which was people are going to share what they know because it's altruistic. They're just going to do it out of the goodness of their heart in their spare time. They're not. Right? You have to think about how you manage that expectation within the business so that it's actually part of their commitments. You know, knowledge transfer, we had a couple of good examples. We've actually coined a term at Microsoft called reciprocal mentoring. Came from education where older teachers and younger teachers actually teach in front of the students, because if lifelong learning is important, it's probably good for educators to actually show that they're learning in front of students rather than sending them home when they do in-service training or whatever that is, because none of us have ever seen that happen. And so, you know, let's bring that learning in front. It's also becoming now something that corporations are looking at, enterprises. How do we teach people to learn how to learn? Productivity, we talked a little bit about control. I won't comment on control because I don't want to offend any of the people who like control in the room. And then knowledge retention and transmission, right? So those are the differences. Those are some very, very, you know, when you're sitting on your social computing environment tonight and you're telling people about your great experience at the SharePoint conference today, none of this stuff is probably crossing your mind. When you're writing the email of your trip report, all of this is on your mind. Right? I have to actually show why I went. I have to explain to people what I learned. Right? There are expectations. I have to send it to these people because there's a process in place for how I do my trip reports. And I mentioned the industrial age. So this is Frederick Taylor. Frederick Taylor was from Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, New Jersey. I've done quite a bit of work with them. There's a bust of him in the House School of Management. And he basically said, this is how we work, right? We do these work breakdown structures, very linear, invented scientific management. And I don't know if you've ever tried to apply scientific management to a marketing effort, to an R&D effort. We do that, right? There was a cover of Business Week a few years ago that said how Six Sigma almost killed 3M because they were trying to put all of these process restrictions on R&D, and they went from having a huge number of new products in the market because they were creative and risk-taking to being risk-adverse and process-oriented to the point that they just couldn't meet their corporate goals anymore. And so we have to recognize that the world looks more like this today in some areas, right? I'm not suggesting that factories all of a sudden go, oh, we'll just make whatever we want to make today. But that you have to think about the knowledge work that we do as an iterative process of socializing and producing and re-socializing and understanding, and a cycle versus a line. This is a very important concept. If you walk away with nothing else from this session today, think about this one. Economics of accidents. The fundamental reason that you cannot write a return on investment calculation for social computing, for email, for telephones, is because you have no idea, while you're investing in the technology, what anybody's going to do with it. Right? If I take a cell of people out of a factory and replace them with a robot, I know what the fully loaded burden of those people are, healthcare costs, salary, etc., and I know what the cost of the robot is and its maintenance cycles and uptime and everything else. I can make a very, very easy trade-off between those two things. When I talk about social computing, I have no idea who's going to talk to whom, what they're going to talk about. If they ever talk about business, what are they going to talk about in terms of the business? Is it going to have a business value realization associated with it? And if so, what's the magnitude and the time to realization? I have no idea. So not only should you not worry, because when you look at the chart about people not measuring ROI, this actually tells you why. It's not that you shouldn't watch as you experiment, and I think that's a key, is that as we're rolling out technology, that we actually do understand, here's how we started the process, or here's how we started doing whatever we were doing, and we introduced the new technology, and here's how it changed us. And we can measure that. But we have no idea ahead of time what's going to happen. And so that's why I call that the economics of accidents, because what social computing can do, but you have to watch for it, because it's kind of like a physics experiment. You have to kind of watch for the decay of the particle or the increase of the particle or whatever you're looking for, because what social computing can do is increase the number of accidents that you have happen, right? If you're just talking about people talking to who they know through an email link, that's a completely different thing than opening up, being transparent, and going, oh, I never even knew this person was even interested in that, and they may have a great insight, and they're not part of that thread. Right? You're increasing the number of accidents within the organization in a good way, right? We also have to think about people as brokers. When you go through a downsizing or there's a merger and acquisition, there are some people that you kind of look around and you go, why does that person work here? And they look at you and they go, you know, they know a lot of people, but I really don't know what they do. And you go, well, let's put them on the list. And you then realize the processes that get broken, because you had broken processes before, but you had this broker person facilitating the exchange of information. And that becomes very visible in social network analysis. I've seen some great work out of MIT and the Stern School of Management where it actually shows the interactions between people, and people who are key to conversations that you might not presume were key to those conversations. And so they discovered through social network analysis who knew what and why people were asking advice. And it was very different than the organizational structure of the company. So Framingham, Massachusetts. Have you guys seen the study from Framingham? I think it's very much a social computing phenomenon. It was covered in Wired. There's a book out about it. And so the first one is obesity. I obviously know some people in Framingham. In 1948, there were 10% people obese. 1985, 16%. And then 2000, 40% obesity. And this is the study that said if your friends are fat, you're going to be fat. You probably heard that one, right? So 37% better chance if you are married to somebody who's overweight. If you have a friend who's overweight too, 171% chance that you're going to be overweight. Right? That's a social networking phenomenon. That is a social phenomenon, right? But it's not just all bad, right? So there's good stuff too, right? So smoking. In 1971, there were, smoking was kind of just integrated into the society. And then in 2000, we started seeing the ostracizing of people. That's a social phenomenon, right? We said, you're not part of the group. You have to stand out in minus 32 degrees and smoke on the curb while it's snowing. And then you can come back in after you use some mouthwash, right? But up to 4 degrees of separation. 4 degrees of separation, that's a social networking term, right? So 4 degrees of separation, friends stopped smoking, 36% likely because they were part of this group effort to get people to stop smoking, right? They still ate donuts, but they stopped smoking. Right? And then they looked at happiness, right? It's one of my favorite... I'm a Star Trek fan, and one of my favorite things is when Spock is getting his brain back in one of the early movies, and it says at the end, "Are you happy?" Right? It's when I build personas of people in the future, it's one of the last questions I ask: is this person happy? Because if they're not happy, then we probably missed something, or we're obviously not looking in the right direction. But this was, smilers got together in clusters. People who smile on Facebook have 15% more friends than those who don't. So if you have a frowning picture on Facebook, walk outside, have somebody take your camera, and take a picture of you smiling, and you're going to have more friends later today, right? And even unhappy people at the center of the network were infected and were more likely to have overall infected by happiness, right? So if they were at the center of a happy network, they eventually became happier versus people who were off to the side smoking, right? And if your friends are happy, you'll be happy. So try to be happy. All right. So that was I think some interesting stuff about the value. Now think about that in the context of change in an organization, right? I'm about to tell you that we don't know what the future looks like, right? We took uncertainties and we decided, is globalization going to continue or not in our scenario planning efforts, right? Is globalization inevitable? Thomas Friedman wrote The World is Flat. He told us the answer. If a futurist comes to you and says the world is flat and that the globalization is inevitable, do not pay them because they're probably wrong. If a futurist comes to you and says, I'm not really a futurist, the world may be flat, but it also may not be, and let me tell you why, then they're probably have some value, and hopefully that's something I can impart to you today, because we don't know. We are seeing forces against globalization. We cannot presume that the world tomorrow is going to be an extrapolation of the trends of today. Trends are a great way of marching off over a cliff sometimes. You may get lucky and you may be right. I have on my blog the moniker that being a futurist means only one thing: I can't be wrong today. Okay. And then we have the vertical axes of, is the world going to be command and control, hierarchical, or is it going to be networked and emergent, bottom up? And we end up with these 4 very different worlds, right? Large companies, oligopolies, and proud tower where people work and work to live, right? Where the global phenomenon of our kind of pop culture of America, where I've traveled all over the world, and sometime in a club near midnight, anywhere in the world, if the country's like the United States or not, I hear Gloria Gaynor sing I Will Survive. Still happens in Proud Tower, right? Continental Drift, not so much, because Gloria Gaynor's American. And we listen to local music, right? We have had a fracturing event. It may be a cyber terror attack. It may be a disease outbreak. But for some reason, the world has fractured, and we are no longer as global as we are today. Boundaries have gone up. The movement of bits is not as important anymore as the movement of physical objects. To some degree, the global financial crisis has given us some of that, because credit was not available, and so we saw ships setting off China unable to pull out of port because they didn't have credit in bills of lading that allowed them to move. Right? The frontier friction, a completely devolved economy driven by the taking out by terrorists or some technical phenomenon of the data at several large banks. So today you sign onto your 401k and it says, here's how much wealth you have lost. In this future it says, who are you? That's a very different place, right? It's a place where people start pushing back against technology because they don't trust the people who turn their money into ones and zeros. right? Very different place. Social computing is not the same in these futures, right? And then Freelance Planet, the world that the millennial generation is taking us to kicking and screaming, where we see social computing as the way that people get work done. It becomes the container of work. It becomes, instead of looking at process and saying, here's a project that we have to do, we start off with people deciding that there's some action that needs to take place, and they build the process underneath the social construct, completely upside down from the way we may work today. And so, very different futures. And so as we look out in a decade, and there's much more in the book, Listening to the Future, where we actually explore all of these in great detail, you can't presume that tomorrow is going to be like today. We do put some stakes in the ground. This is a map, and this is, I believe, going to be up on our website in a few weeks, where we put some stakes in the ground and we said, what could the world be like, right, if we were to actually forecast it versus reason over it. And there were a number of very big social phenomena that came out of this, right? And so these are across the top are the areas of research that we're doing, and then down the side it's the organizational influence, middle management, and personal. But when you look at everybody collaborating, pervasive service, global creative class, and freelance capabilities in terms of how we outsource things, reciprocal mentoring, attention management, great customer expectations, these are all social phenomenon that the social computing environment is going to affect, however it comes out. Now again, this is us putting some stuff down to say this is what could be. I will be happy to have a conversation with you if you disagree with this at the break, and that's what it's for. Feel free to disagree or augment those kinds of ideas. So given all of this, what do we need to do in terms of social computing? You need to start off by thinking about a way that social computing is going to affect your enterprise. It is not something you just say, we're going to plop it in and let's see what happens. You might want to actually experiment a little bit and say, here's an area where we're trying to understand knowledge transfer better. Here's a place that we're trying to understand our customers better. And make sure that you are watching that and not just letting it happen. The key is watching it. You will not be able to necessarily, it's scientific method, right? You're going to have a hypothesis. I think social computing is going to help me understand my customers better. And don't stop there. Did it help you understand your customers better? You have to actually watch. In many cases, this is not a rapid phenomenon. This is not something that's going to happen overnight. So you have to watch it for some time. I know in corporations driven by quarterly results that patience is a difficult thing, but this is an area where you need to understand patience as well, right? You also need to understand risk, protecting IP, and making sure that you understand what any risks are. You have to also then do internal marketing and education and training and other things to make sure that the people involved in the experiment actually know what's going on. Do they understand the tools? Do they understand the expectations, et cetera? Because again, this is not just something that's going to pop up as it does in the consumer world. It's something that you have to plan for and you have to experiment with. When we look at one of the areas, as I mentioned, was the experts from outside the company, right? So being able to actually identify where there are already social constructs. Somebody writes a blog about your product. We have this all the time. There are expert users who are not Microsoft employees. They may not even be Microsoft partners. They are experts, and people go to their blog to read their opinions about how to deploy SharePoint better, for instance, right? How do we learn? How can we take advantage of that as a company to learn from those people and say, what are we not providing that that person's providing? And I think every one of us has a product or a process or a service that we can probably learn from people who are recipients of that service or interact with us in that service or product. And I think that's a great way of thinking about this in a way that brings it in as value to the organization. Be strategic about it. It's okay to pick a little experimental place that you may say is low risk, but at the end of the day, the project manager is going to walk into corporate management and go, yeah, I did this thing where we talked to about 12 customers and they gave us some really good insights. Right? It was really low risk and it didn't really do much for us, but it worked. Right? We learned some stuff from those customers. Think about it strategically. right? Understand how the social construct that you're trying to build fits into the corporate goals. Make sure it's meaningful, and then make sure you also, again, understand what it was before and what it's going to be going forward. One of the biggest issues that we see is, and this is across IT in general, and there's some very specific things here, is avoiding false metrics. Right? In the knowledge management world, it was, we had 500 people post 68 gigabytes of information to our knowledge management database. We were very successful. What I didn't say was that anybody read anything that was there, took action on anything that was there, commented on anything, right? It was just participation. We were measuring the wrong thing. So there's some examples of, the number of connections per user. We're still learning this stuff, right? This is all new inside of corporations. Cross-postings and blogs. Proof that somebody's actually using the stuff and consuming it and turning it into value, right? That they believe that they learned something that they can take to the next level. A range of adoption so that it's not just your little experiment, but that it actually gets used elsewhere, right? And so think about the metrics that you use. The next steps: experiment, monitor, learn. Right? It's the easiest bullet chart you will see all day today. If you don't build it, they will go someplace else. Just like I talked about the bank, right? There are employees of yours who want to use social computing for work, right? They will go someplace else, right? And your question, to some degree, is probably something that's crossing the minds of a lot of managers is, why am I going to do work on this site that's nothing but advertising, right? And think about the some of the things that we do through advertising, right? Through radio and television, magazines, etc. But we usually don't work through those. And so we're now going out and we have employees actually doing work stuff on places that are only their only way of existing is through advertising revenue. And that's a good call for some of the things that we want to do internally, because this does not bode well for permanence, right? Those sites may not be there. If you become reliant on a social networking site in the consumer world, it may not be there in the future. So we have to continue to look at the interface between the enterprise social phenomenon and the consumer social phenomenon where they do take place. There are legitimate reasons to be concerned, right? Corporate embarrassment. People will post things that may not be flattering to the enterprise, right? Loss of intellectual property. It's just another distraction. We talked about that, right? A new entry point for viruses. All right, we have to keep an eye on that. Our teams are certainly looking at that. Employee harassment. That was some of the speculation. I saw several places where they were talking about that this is likely that you're eventually going to see a lawsuit where somebody was harassed by a fellow employee outside of the company. Now, think about that as a completely new thing, right? When we talk about social computing, it's really not different. It doesn't really change things. You don't have this today, right? This is something that would be completely exterior to the business, right? And transparent crowds make it easy, maybe too easy to follow, right? And so as you look at the transparency, the competitive advantage may be something that you worry about, right? Because you're now putting all this stuff out there and people can start looking at what's happening with your employees and your customers, and they start guessing better at what you're doing, right? Which may mean that you have to react faster. But those are legitimate reasons for concern. Now, this was a study done back in 2007 and by ClearSwift, a security company in the UK, where it said 46% of people talked about work with people who didn't work with their company. Now, how many people have ever signed on to a social computing platform and had it say, before you have this conversation, would you mind signing an NDA? Probably hasn't happened, right? But that's a legitimate risk. Now, is this overstating it? Because there is new research showing that people actually aren't using consumer social sites, right? This is very recent data, completely different set of people, however, from CIO magazine, where people were saying they aren't really using it. I did not see all the questions that went into this, but I certainly, my conversations with our customers are that a number of people are using it. It's probably a little higher than this. So somewhere between those two numbers is probably reality, right? There's also risks of not adopting social computing, right? The things that you won't get. People will use it, but they won't understand how or why, and they won't tell you when they were successful, why they were successful, and you'll continue to be baffled, right? And that's something that if you take that experiment and watch, is something that you will not have happen, right? Competitors will master it and leave you behind, right? You can take that as one of those kind of putting up the smoke signal things, but that's something that could happen. Insights from customers that you might have missed, right? So there's just all this lost opportunity, and then the higher cost of finding information, right? Social computing may be a way of facilitating the discovery of expertise and discovery of information, and it is something that you may lose if you don't actually embrace it. So as I said, here's a process for kind of thinking through, getting started, measuring the results, starting small, picking something strategic and meaningful, and thinking about a platform. Because the other thing that you may want to consider is when you look at the technology side, is it better to use something that we have, right? And you guys are all sitting at a conference looking at one of the premier places for sharing information, or do you go off and buy a bunch of piecemeal things that it becomes hard to integrate? And so that's something you need to consider from the architecture side. So when you rethink social computing, think about it as a fundamental shift in communication. Think about it as that there are one of the things when you measure it, you're actually going to say, well, I have to go out and buy this stuff, I have to do all of these processes, and because you don't know what the outcome is going to be, it's going to be much easier to measure the infrastructure cost and the management time involved than the outcome. That's just how it is because, as I explained the economics of accidents, you're not going to know what the outcome is. And so you have to realize that you're going to be able to measure the inputs much easier than the outputs at this point. Social computing is already part of the way we do business. So you already, in many marketing organizations, put social tags and other kinds of tag capabilities inside of things that you post on the web. So you are doing things in this area already. Being engaged, this is important, being engaged in the consumer world is not a strategy. Saying my company has a Twitter account is not a social computing strategy. Right? Saying that we have a fan page on Facebook is not a social computing strategy. You have to think about it when we're talking about enterprise social computing. Even if that is part of it, I have a fan page, what are you learning from that? What are people posting on it? How is it integrated with your CRM? Many companies are making the mistake of creating social computing groups to watch what's happening in social computing and not integrating that with the CRM systems. They're the same thing, it's just a different channel. Right? So you have to think about how you do that integration. And then finally, social computing may expose some problems. Right? So I mentioned functional silos earlier. When you say, well, people are using it, but they're not sharing information across corporate boundaries of organization, that's not social computing's problem. That is an organizational issue, and social computing may bring it to light, because as you start monitoring and measuring and you say, well, we're having these problems with people not sharing information, that's cultural. It is not the technology stopping you from sharing. It's the people deciding not to share. Right? And so there may be some things in your company that you don't want to know about because it's easier just to say, well, if I'm just getting my job done, I don't have to know about those. Social computing, when you make those experiments, may actually expose some of that. So I'll leave you with this thought from Chris Howard at the Burton Group that an antisocial organization is ultimately non-productive. And so if you still have the industrial age bent of looking at everything as a factory, even in that world, you have people working with other people, you have supply chains, you have customers, and if you do not recognize the social aspects of the organization, you're probably missing some very important inputs. And I will stop talking now. And oh, look, I made it right on time. Thank you very much for joining this morning, and I'll be happy to take some questions.
Did we just grab the mic?
Yes, you behind the light.
So, appreciate the talk. What advice would you have for a large multinational organization that has a lot of cross-cultural issues. So they build a network based on one parameter. They then try to bring it over to an India office. They try to bring it into Japan. Have you had experience with that, and have you seen issues with that?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things. I have a whole other presentation that I do around kind of cultural sensitivity. And one of the things we actually did was look at the word collaboration, and we realized that collaboration, for instance, in some languages have 5 different meanings. And so again, that's a cultural issue, not a social computing issue, making sure that we recognize cultural differences. And so when we say things and we set expectations, there may be very, very different cultural expectations around things like, I post something before my manager sees it. Right? We have to recognize that, because if we put the technology in place and we go, India is just not participating, and what's wrong? Well, it's not that it's wrong, it's that they have a different way of thinking about how they would share information among people, and we have to actually recognize that, and we have to talk about it, we have to negotiate through it, and we have to recognize that the outcomes are going to be different, right? The just kind of Wild West in America, we'll put up anything, everybody's got a bright idea and we're happy to share it, is not shared around the world. Right? And so we have to actually think about that cultural sensitivity when we're deploying these kinds of systems. So, that's it. There's no technological answer to it. I think it's something that, there are plenty of people out there that do corporate culture shifts and cultural understanding through companies that might be valuable to you. So, yes.
Hi, I work for a research-led university in the UK, and essentially our business is idea generation and knowledge generation.
Yep.
Our demographic, a large number of the faculty are professors who've been around for a while. Our head of department actually printed his emails and replied by writing on them and giving them to his secretary.
Huh.
How do you see this integrating social computing in an organisation where the demographic is skewed towards the older generations?
Well, first of all, I think the older generation is not necessarily going to immediately change the way that they work, right? Because this person sounds like they've actually, before the invention of movable type, perhaps they were involved in that, right? I actually had the pleasure last time I was in the UK of teaching at Eton, so I understand where you're coming from. Very progressive head of technology, but the rest of the people, we were doing long-range scenario planning, and they were all going, well, why are you teaching students how to think about the future in this way? It was very different than anything they usually taught in Eton. But I think from the standpoint of the students who are engaging it, they're going to be doing it, right? So there will probably be some generational dissonance. I remember when I was in manufacturing in the early days, we had production planners who wouldn't use the computer, and they said, my production cards are more accurate than my computer. And so the vice president of manufacturing and I came in one Saturday and took all the production cards and locked them in a room, to which we were the only ones that had the key, and we said to the people, if you spend as much time keeping the computer accurate as you did your cards, the computer would be accurate too. Right? So sometimes there's a little bit of draconian stuff that needs to happen, probably hard to do with a professor in a UK university. But I think the students, especially when we start talking about grad students, they're going to be using this stuff. And I think that, and when I mentioned the reciprocal mentoring is something that came from education, some professors are going to be open to that and some aren't. And it's really, at some stage, retirement is the answer to the problem over the course of time. I wish I had a better answer for you. But that's we have to deal with the reality of the situations that we're presented with, right?
Thank you.
So.
Thank you. Very good presentation.
Thank you.
If the sharing information is really fundamental to the value that's received from it, and I would propose that the tagging of information is also as critical in terms of being able to sort out the relevance, how can we implement, I guess I would call tacit knowledge management, where it doesn't take someone to say, gee, I need to send this on or I need to post it to, but rather the system automatically does that?
Yeah. I think we're getting there, right? I mean, one of the difficulties that we have is that we often now have to tag things because we don't have great discovery engines. I think we're getting much better at that. I'm sure our friends at FAST will be happy to talk to you about, extracting features from unstructured content. And I think that's something that is on the uprise in terms of technological support. Search engines are phenomenal now in terms of not just looking at strings of text, but actually being able to understand the categories and things that they're related to, and also extract from the environment, right? So if we look at SharePoint, if I'm associated with a website that's about a topic, a lot of my content can inherit that association, right? And so, we're starting to get to the point that I think technology is doing a great job of, or at least a decent job of helping uncover some of those things. And I think search is much more organic than, and I continue to have a problem with the Web 3.0 view of the semantic network where everybody's going to have all these tags. We're going to have technology that discovers that, because people are not going to sit around and tag everything all the time. Yeah, sure.
Hi, I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
I've been talking to people the last couple of days about using SharePoint as the platform for their internal social computing strategy. And I've been genuinely shocked by how many people are saying they aren't even, they're a million miles away from even allowing my sites to be switched on.
Yep.
Because of risk of litigation or whatever. Can you say, I really want the world to move in this direction, to use SharePoint as a social computing platform. Can you say anything that can convince people otherwise?
Yeah, well, I think it's the fear and risk factor and the regulatory environment. So there are some organizations that are very open to it. And I think part of it's going to be competitive, right? I mean, I've seen lots of different flows of systems. I go back to when ERP was called MRP. And we said the exact same things. Why should we do material requirements planning? Because all of our competitors are doing it, right? And so I think part of it's going to be that there will be early adopters in all of these kinds of technology adoptions, and the stories will get out. And I'm a big believer in storytelling, and I believe that stories change culture. And so as the stories come out, that organizations will start to make that shift. The problem that they're currently experiencing is they have alternate stories, right? Their stories are about risk and fear and litigation and other things. And so we have to get to the point that we're telling positive stories and that those positive stories are meaningful and authentic, and we're not just making them up. And I think that's how you start shifting, making that shift. And so, continuing to engage in the dialogue, making sure that where, from the vendor and supplier standpoint, that we're watching and helping expose, great customer stories from our customers about what's going on in the market. And certainly, trade magazines and blogs and other places are going to be making those stories available to people as well. And I think, again, we have to be patient. This is not something that's going to happen overnight because, again, social computing is something that, you're right, for the companies that are ready to embrace it, they're going to get great value very early. But for the companies that are resisting it, trying to say that social computing is going to solve their problems in terms of fear of people, having information up that they don't want shared, it's not going to get them over that. Right? We have to get them over that fear first before we can get them into the technology.
Okay.
So.
Hi. What differences do you see in the way that enterprises are using social computing and governments are using it with the whole sort of Gov 2.0
Yep.
Campaigns, etc.?
And let me, since I see some people, I'll answer that in 1 second. Let me just make sure that I say before you guys leave that you got the evaluations, et cetera. There's the evaluation thing, and et cetera. So the evaluations, keep in mind that your evaluation of me is inversely proportional to your golf handicap, so just keep that in mind. Anyway, so government versus enterprise. So from the government standpoint, I'm actually seeing a little bit more in some governments, a little bit less, I should say, less risk issue, because they are recognizing that they really need to transform themselves. And so there's a lot of governments who are really looking at reinvention because the citizen phenomenon and the engagement through the consumer world, because to some degree, they're much closer to the consumer world than enterprises who can kind of say, yeah, I put a product into market and I've got these processes in place. When citizens start complaining about something, it's pretty right there, right? I mean, they have to deal with those comments. And I think they're trying to figure out better ways of engaging with that. And so they're very much focused on this kind of consumer to enterprise bridge, right? How do we bring those comments in and actually take action on them? Probably not as much on the silo breaking down. That crosses organizational types from government to, but I think governments are actually recognizing, again, because, and I think a huge issue is budgets. So we're now starting to see we're at Dow 10,000 again. Hopefully we're still at Dow 10,000. I haven't looked this morning. But as we move into periods where companies are making more profit, they may be less motivated to change what they're doing. governments are highly motivated because they do not have the money to keep operating the way they've operated. They have fewer employees and they've got to get more done, and they're looking at social networking, social computing as a way of, saving costs as well. So that's.
What's your take on people wanting to remain anonymous within the within different organizations? Any research you've done or what you've seen at other companies?
Yeah, most of it's pretty anecdotal. I think within the enterprise, it's pretty hard to stay, anonymous, because you're part of, at least if you're using our technology, you're part of the Active Directory structure, right? And so you have corporate policies defining that you have to use your real name. That's very different than the consumer world, right? And so one of the things that is interesting, I think we're going to see the millennials to some degree kind of game at least the consumer world, where they're not going to have a single identification. There's a great desire on the behalf of many, many organizations, from healthcare looking at universal healthcare records to marketing organizations trying to track what's happening with consumers across their entire spectrum of engagement. And the millennial generation is not having any of that, right? They're saying, I'm going to sign on to these various sites with different passwords and different names so that people can't track my totality of my consumer experience. I think in enterprises it's not going to be an issue. I think the bigger issue is going to be some of the stuff that we see in Europe around labor unions. Because I actually had a conversation with an organization at one point that said, I can't have somebody's expertise discovered, because if they look like they know more than somebody else in the same job grade, then they probably are going to ask for a promotion. And that's a bigger issue, I think, than anonymity. So,
Thanks.
let's see, one final question.
With regards to the adoption rate in the enterprise social networking platform, do you find that it's better to come from the executives down or from the ground up?
I think it's best to meet in the middle. And I don't mean that just as a cop-out, because I think at some point you're going to have people at the, from the grassroots side figuring out how to do things, but if it doesn't get to the level that it's valued at a strategic, that's actually seen as strategic value, I don't think it's ever going to have the impact on the organization that it could. So I think the really successful implementations are going to be where executives actually recognize that this is something that is part of, and I'm very big on strategy as a differentiator in a market as a definition. And if this is a way that you differentiate your employee experience, your customer experience, your R&D capabilities, your service delivery, and you use this, it has to be strategic. It can't just be a bunch of groups doing things randomly. They have to negotiate to, saying, here's the Northern Star that we're trying to hit as a company, and here's how this technology and this capability allows us to reach that. And I think those are the ones that we're going to be reading about, as great examples of this. I think we're going to be reading about a lot of grassroots stuff, because trade magazines are a great way for people to say, I just did this in my department, and then they take out that trade magazine article and show it to people around their department, around their company, as a way of telling stories. But until it gets to the point that is really of strategic value, it's not going to be quite as powerful as it could be. Great. Well, thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully you'll come back for Elena in a little bit and hear the second part of this conversation around adoption. Thank you.